The drama surrounding Janibek Alimkhanuly and Vincenzo Gualtieri began long before the opening bell echoed through the Fort Bend Epicenter in Rosenberg, Texas. This was not simply another night of professional boxing, this was a middleweight title unification that carried the weight of two careers, two nations, and two very different philosophies of what it means to be a world champion. On one side stood Janibek Alimkhanuly, the Kazakh southpaw known as Janbeck, a man who had navigated over 300 amateur fights before turning professional, carrying with him a pedigree so deep and a skill set so refined that many in the boxing world considered him almost untouchable. On the other side stood Vincenzo Gualtieri, the Italian-German fighter nicknamed Illinois Capo, a man who had clawed his way to a world title by stopping Falca with a devastating uppercut in his last outing, arriving in Texas with belief, ambition, and an unbeaten record that he hoped would speak louder than any pre-fight prediction. The two men met in the middle of the ring, heard the referee's instructions, touched gloves, and walked back to their corners carrying the dreams of everyone who had traveled with them, and what followed was one of the most one-sided, technically masterful displays of boxing that the middleweight division had witnessed in recent memory. From the very first seconds of round one, it became abundantly clear that something was different about Janibek Alimkhanuly. There was a calm about him, an almost unsettling sense of patience, as if he had already watched this fight play out in his mind 100 times before stepping through the ropes. He moved forward deliberately, his southpaw stance creating immediate geometrical problems for the orthodox Gualtieri, using his jab like a measuring instrument, not just to score points but to gather information about every defensive habit, every reflex, every millisecond of hesitation that Gualtieri possessed. Gualtieri, to his credit, tried to adapt early, switching his stance at times from orthodox to southpaw in an attempt to disrupt the rhythm that Alimkhanuly was so clearly attempting to establish. But these transitions were noticed immediately by those at ringside and, more dangerously, by Alimkhanuly himself, who had told the media before fight night that he intended to catch Gualtieri precisely in those transitional moments when his feet weren't fully set. The Kazakh fighter was not just watching. He was cataloging. The commentary team observed something telling during those opening moments. Gualtieri had a habit of walking with his hands low, briefly dropping his guard as he moved around the ring before raising them back into his earmuff defensive position. It was a small crack, barely visible to the casual viewer, but against a fighter of Alimkhanuly's intelligence and power, small cracks have a tendency to become catastrophic fissures. Janbeck baited him constantly, using feints to gauge reactions, stepping half a step back to create the precise distance he needed before landing that authoritative left hand with the kind of thud that reverberates through an arena and silences even the most enthusiastic crowd for just a brief, ominous moment. By the time the bell ended round one, the narrative of the fight was already being written in bold letters on every scorecard in the building. Round two did nothing to change the story. If anything, it deepened the sense of inevitability. Alimkhanuly was not hurrying. He was a man who understood that great fighters do not rush greatness. He controlled the space between them with surgical precision, using his jab to split Gualtieri's guard and his footwork to neutralize whatever advantages the German fighter tried to manufacture. A double jab from Alimkhanuly midway through the round served as a particularly sharp reminder of just how dangerous the Kazakh was at closing distances. He could shrink the space between them instantly, land his shots, and return to safety before Gualtieri could organize a meaningful response. In Gualtieri's corner between rounds, trainer Frankie Salama was already growing frustrated, telling his fighter that he was taking unnecessary punishment because he simply wasn't listening, that he needed to be using feints, creating movement, giving Janbeck something different to think about. But knowing what you need to do and actually being able to execute it against a fighter of Alimkhanuly's level are two entirely different conversations. There was also a subtle but important tactical element that began to draw attention in the early rounds. Alimkhanuly was repeatedly stepping on Gualtieri's feet during exchanges, a tactic that disrupts an opponent's balance and rhythm in ways that are difficult to see clearly on television but are brutally felt in real time. It happened twice in succession at one point, and the commentary team noted with some amusement that after the second and third occurrence, it was almost certainly no accident. The referee, however, appeared to be giving this aspect of the fight insufficient attention, and the risk was real. If Gualtieri were to go down from a punch while his foot was pinned, the legitimacy of the knockdown would be deeply compromised. This was the kind of gamesmanship that reminded everyone watching that boxing, at its highest level, is not just a physical contest, it is an intricate, layered mental game fought in inches and fractions of seconds. By the time the unofficial scorer ringside handed in a 3-rounds-to-none scorecard for Alimkhanuly after round 3, nobody was particularly surprised. What was perhaps more striking was how dominant those 3 rounds had felt despite the relative lack of dramatic exchanges. Alimkhanuly was winning the fight the way a grandmaster wins a chess match, not through desperate gambits or spectacular sacrifices, but through quiet, inexorable positional dominance that slowly suffocates any hope of a comeback. He was landing 54% of his power punches on the night, a staggering figure compared to his career average of 36%, and against Gualtieri, a man who was throwing less than half the volume of his opponent, those numbers painted a picture that was becoming increasingly hard to look at if you were in the Gualtieri camp. The 5th round is where the fight transformed from a boxing lesson into something far more visceral and urgent. Alimkhanuly finally uncorked that left uppercut, the punch he had been setting up from the opening moments, the punch that Brian Valoria in his corner had been calling for, the punch that everyone in the building seemed to sense was coming before it arrived. It landed flush on Gualtieri's chin, and the German fighter reeled backward with the unmistakable look of a man whose legs had momentarily disconnected from his brain. The arena erupted. For one suspended second, it appeared that the fight was over, that Gualtieri would crumple to the canvas and the referee would wave it off before the night deepened further. But Gualtieri, to his enormous credit, did not go down. He moved his feet, absorbed the panic of the moment, and bought himself time with the kind of sheer stubborn will that champions, even outmatched ones, tend to possess in abundance. He had never been knocked down in his entire professional career, and he was not about to allow that to change in round 5 without a fight. The recovery was genuinely impressive, and it briefly raised a tantalizing question about whether Gualtieri's chin and heart might be enough to carry him through to the later rounds, where fatigue and accumulated damage might begin to equalize things. His trainer Frankie Saloma had pointed out in the corner that the key was getting Alimkhanuly to miss and then making him pay, creating enough doubt in the Kazakh's mind to disrupt that rhythmic, patient assault. But Alimkhanuly, to his immense credit, was not a fighter who allowed individual rounds to derail his game plan. In his corner, Valoria told him to stay the course, to not let Gualtieri find his footing and gain the kind of confidence that might reopen the fight. And Janbeck listened. He returned to his work with the disciplined calm of a craftsman who has been interrupted briefly but knows exactly where he left off. As the fight progressed into its middle and later rounds, the commentary became increasingly philosophical and increasingly pointed. There was a moment where one of the analysts said plainly that while Gualtieri was indeed a world champion, that title did not automatically make him a great fighter. Champions could be created by favorable matchmaking, by a single good night, by catching an opponent on the wrong evening. But greatness, real, undeniable, lasting greatness, was something else entirely, and it was sitting across the ring from Vincenzo Gualtieri wearing green trunks trimmed in red. The punch output numbers told their own brutal story, Gualtieri throwing 46 punches compared to Alimkhanuly's 117 over the course of several rounds, a disparity that spoke not just to a tactical deficit but to a deeper, more fundamental gap in confidence. When you are afraid to throw your punches against a man because you know what comes back in return, you have already lost the most important battle in boxing, the one happening inside your own head. One of the most technically beautiful sequences of the entire fight came in round 6, when Alimkhanuly demonstrated precisely why 300 amateur fights produce the kind of layered, deceptive boxing intelligence that is almost impossible to replicate. He threw a flicking jab, not a power jab, but a feeler, a conversation starter, and watched as Gualtieri attempted to counter it. The moment Gualtieri committed to that counter, Alimkhanuly made him miss by the narrowest of margins and immediately returned fire with his own offense, punishing Gualtieri for the very act of trying to compete. It was the boxing equivalent of setting a trap and watching it spring. He had told the media before the fight that he was going to catch Gualtieri